Welcome to the Vice President's session. I think we've got some fantastic speakers lined up this morning. It's a very interesting topic which I think is important to all of us. We implant devices in nearly every case we do, or use devices as we've seen in the last presentations. There's a slight change in order, so Professor Tim Briggs is going to join us online, and I think we're going to get him to speak first. But just as a quick outline of the morning, my colleague Seamus Harrison is going to speak to us about our experience with Nelex, and I'm sure that will be interesting for those of you who didn't use the device, and our experience subsequent to the failure of that device. Sonia Mcleod, who I met last night, has come to speak to us. She works at the University of Oxford. She's a lawyer, and she will be talking to us about the Cumberledge Review, first do no harm report, which she was the chief investigator for in terms of research. And there's some lessons I'm sure we can learn from Sonia. Declan Dunphy has worked with me and the NVR team to add devices to the aortic data set, and worked very closely with Declan. Declan is the cardiovascular lead for the ABHI, and so he'll have some interesting things to tell us about industry. And finally, Arun Fawani is going to tell us about some of the early data we've managed to capture since we started collecting aortic devices within the NVR. And that's thanks to most of the people in the room, because the ascertainment rates are very good for non-compulsory data. So I think we're going to kick off straight off with Tim, and he's hopefully going to be online.
Yes, I am. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and I hope everybody can hear you. I'm in my clinic here at Bolsover Street at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital, and I'm sorry I can't be with you today. But if I may, I'm going to tell you a story about how the National Joint Registry has been pivotal in the GIRF programme, and then go back to the beginnings of that and how we are able, I think, going forward, to bring all registries up to a standard that I think we can all be very proud of. So the GIRF programme, as everybody knows, started in orthopaedics on the basis about quality improvement and patient safety, but also re-empowering us as clinicians in driving the way we do things, change to get better outcomes for our patients. And what brought this around really was my experience as a consultant at the RNOH, where I saw conditions like this sent to me, where if we'd done things slightly differently, we wouldn't have had this poor patient having had 2 revisions within 3 years on the right, and requiring a further revision within 1 year of that implant on the left. And so I thought we had to do something about it. We were the first to bring data together. And if you can see there, I've highlighted in the GIRF orthopedics that we had 12 sets of data bring together, but I've highlighted which was the most important for joint replacement. And clearly it was the National Joint Registry, because what we wanted was data that people could trust, that we could use with the discussions of clinical leadership to drive real change. The NJR data also gave me credibility, because I was able, in some difficult conversation with colleagues about implants they were using, to show my data in terms of my 10-year revision rates for hip and knee replacements. And that shows that I was 2 standard deviations below the mean. And that actually gave me credibility of talking the talk and also walking the walk. So I could have those difficult discussions because that data was available at my fingertips. As a consequence of the GIRF programme in orthopedics, we made massive change. It was voluntary, remember, and we saw significant change in every trust across the country. And we were able then to work out exactly what that was in terms of actions completed and agreed by trust. And we could also translate how better care was also responding to actual financial savings, which could be used again for frontline services. It also gave us the ability to challenge some decision making. So here is a patient with osteoarthritis of the hip who's age 65. And if you use a cemented implant, as I've shown, it's surrounded by green, the cost to the taxpayer and the NHS is about £650. But the surgeon who chose to do this procedure decided to use that very complicated prosthesis. Cost is about £5,000. And because we had the NJR data and another set of data called spend comparison, we were able and are able now to demonstrate that the lower cost devices actually give better value and much better outcomes, because we're able to overlay revision rates of these prostheses against the cost, both nationally and at trust level. So for us, the NJR has always been a really powerful a tool. And we can see here over the years of the GIRF program, again, as a consequence of using data for the National Joint Registry, how we've seen a gradual reduction in costs of primary knee and primary hip replacement across all parts of the NHS. And as we go forward with the elective recovery, and we know we're in very difficult times at the moment, I'm leading a program called the High Volume Low Complexity, which is 29 pathways across 6 surgical specialties. And here's the orthopedic one. And while I'll just bring you to the day of surgery in the box at the bottom, what we've now been able to do, because of the NJR and the support of the BOA, is actually highlight what we want colleagues to use in their practice when undertaking hip replacement of cemented and using ODEP prostheses, which I'll come on to in just a minute. So it has and will continue to change practice. If you now march forward to where we are now, we've got 31 national reports, including the Vascular report, which was carried out, undertaken by Mike Horrocks, and I've again in front of you would like to thank him for all his hard work in that. You can see that we have used registries and audit data in a lot of the data packs that we've got. So for us, having registries that we are confident with and we know are fully utilized is going to be absolutely imperative going forward within the NHS. Now, if you look at the history of this, it's we still unfortunately run into trouble. We're going to hear about the Cumberland report, the vaginal mesh. We've had the breast implants. We've had metal prostheses, metal on metal. I've had heart disease advice around that. And so what there has been as a result of all these is a timeline and development of registry. So the orthopedic NJR started in 2003, really following on for the 1998 3M capital hip implant scandal. And then I see that your National Vascular Registry was commissioned in 2013. And what is really good now is that I had a conversation with the Secretary of State in June 2020, and we were asked, and I was asked to lead the medical registry piece, working with NHS as we drove things forward with the GIRF program to get registries up to what I think is the exemplar, which is the National Joint Registry that we have in orthopedics. So a bit about the National Joint Registry. So it was founded in 2003, initially using England and Wales, but we now have Northern Ireland, Isle of Man and Guernsey signed up. And when it was started, it was to look at medical devices and pick up failure. But what it still does that, but now it's grown into a much bigger scenario in that it's patient safety, the quality of outcomes, and ensuring really the quality and cost effectiveness of joint replacement surgery, holding us as clinicians also to account for delivering best practice to our patients. And what it does, it collects and monitors information on these joint replacements to improve clinical standards and benefit patients, and as well as also helping clinicians and the orthopedic sector as a whole. It's evolved, there's no doubt about that, and it started with hips and knees, but now includes all shoulder replacements, ankle replacements and elbow replacements. And it's the largest registry in the world, which has now 3.5 million data input procedures. And I think the next line is absolutely crucial. It's more than 98% compliance. And that is because the NJR runs an annual trust audit cycle. And so any registry that I think that we develop going forward has to have that as part of it to make sure that we are happy that the data and the devices are being registered, and therefore we have compliance of that magnitude. People will have seen about the breast cosmetic implant registry highlighted, I think 2 weeks ago, that there are about 9,000 implants that haven't been recorded. We cannot have that with our registries going forward, and the NJR now has that sort of degree of compliance, which I think is brilliant. They produce an annual report, and the great thing, it is clinically led, and I cannot emphasize that we as clinicians really need to step up to the plate and take charge of this, because we can ask the right questions and we can drive it in a certain way. And because of that, it has the confidence of the profession. Currently, it's funded from trusts and industry as a subscription, and then depending on the volumes used, trusts are charged a sliding scale depending on their volumes. So this is what we do, and this is what the NGR does. It actually produces publications around individual consultant level data and trust level, and also about implants. So absolutely really important. And any surgeon that has done at least one implant in the last 3 years will be included in that publication. What it also does, it monitors things. So it monitors level data at trust level, and it also monitors surgeon level. And you can see how I put on here of two funnel plots there on the right. If a trust or a surgeon is approaching the two standard deviations above the mean, then what happens is they receive a letter from the National Joint Registrar that we call an alert, highlighting that their results are going in the wrong direction, and that they should look at their data and actually try and address what's going on. If they then, or the trust gets to 3 standard deviations above the mean, that triggers an alarm. And then the surgeon, again, will get a letter from the National Joint Registry, but it also, and then 6 weeks later, the trust will also receive a letter from the responsible officer highlighting the issue of an individual surgeon. And if you get to that level, the chance of that happening by chance is only 1 in 1,000. And I have to say, that has worked really well. And as part of the annual appraisal, one of the things I want as the National Director of Clinical Improvement is that, have you looked at your NJR data? And now you have to look at it and you have to press a button to confirm that you've actually seen it. It's also involved in research, and it makes data widely available for understanding joint diseases, and it's engaged in an active research program, and it also monitors implants for early failure, and also has a big role in supporting beyond compliance and ODEP. So what's ODEP? ODEP is the Orthopedic Device Evaluation Panel, and that looks at implants that have been used over a period of time and gives them a rating. And if you get a 10A rating, that means the evidence is very good, and we can demonstrate that this implant survivorship of 10 years is extremely good. And what we want clinicians to use is ODEP 10A rated implants. And so companies and device manufacturers clearly want to have that, and actually are supportive of what we do. Beyond compliance is a methodology which ensures that new products are assessed and carefully monitored. And again, I highlight that both these programs are run and driven by clinicians. So how does beyond compliance work? So this is where manufacturers come to the NJR, say we've got a new device, we want to put it. So what we want to do is do enhanced surveillance. So there's a full risk assessment, data collection uses the NJR platform, there's monitoring every month, reviews, and user group meetings. So let me give you an example. So on the left here is a new knee replacement, and you can see in the red there that its cumulative revision rate is much higher than we would expect the blue line to be for an established implant. And so what we did is we've worked very closely with the manufacturer, who initially said, well, we think it's the surgeon's fault, but actually we were able to use the information in a very joined up, mature way to find out actually it depended on whether you resurfaced or did not resurface the patella. So on the right hand side is we've now used this information, and you can see now that all surgeons who use this implant now resurface the patella, and you can see that the cumulative revision rate is coming back in line with what we would see for an established implant. So this methodology, I think, works really well. Regarding ODEP, it's going now global, and it is now gradually being utilized in other countries around the world. And I really do believe beyond compliance will do exactly the same. So you can see here what has been the result of the National Joint Registry as an exemplar. So we were all concerned that revision rates would continue to climb in both hip and knee replacements. And what I'm showing you here in hips is mirrored also in knees. And what we've seen is a peak of revisions in 2008, I think the GIRF program has contributed significantly to that, to get people to look at and review their practice. But look at what's happened to the revision rates now for hip replacement since then, right up to the end of 2019. And you can see with that drop off, better for patients, reduce revision rates, reduce burden on the NHS, and actually makes a huge difference in terms of use of our resources. Now I know, and this is I know on the agenda for today about the Neelix example, but I just think what John Boyle said as a consequence of that device, that if the contemporary data suggests that all these devices would actually fail, and if you had a system in place to record these devices and implant and monitor performance, then the issues would have been identified much earlier, and we could have prevented patients coming to harm. So the question is, how do we do that? So if you look at the registries now, it's a bit of a mismatch. I think you say it's not joined up. If you look at NHS England, they're responsible for 5 registries. HQIP have 3, NICOR, the NVR and NJR, and the NHSD have responsible for 2, the breast cosmetic implant registry and the pelvic floor registry. But there are a huge number of over 20 other registries below that, which are funded in different ways and are usually through the societies. And data collection support is I think, is all over the place. So in the future state, what we want is a shared governance future model to get everybody to exemplar the same principles that we've got really in the NJR. So what we really want, as you can see on the right, is a common data collection platform, optimized information governance and data flows, and that goes then into the registries to provide the information that the clinicians decide we need to get hold of and what we need to share out to our colleagues, the NHS, etc. So here's the exemplar data inputs, device level outcome registries with clinical registry function, absolutely clinicians driving that. And then you can see that feeds forward into patient recall alerts and feedback, safety, clinical improvement, clearly post-market surveillance, other outputs. So you can see, I think we've now got a methodology in which we can make a big impact. We're about to just set up the Registries and Medical Device Safety Program Clinical Steering Board, and below that will be the registries, and below that the analytics and the provider support. And so what we are going to have in that, and this is absolutely crucial to me, is the clinical steering groups, and they are very clinically heavy, and I think for the right reason. There will also be a patient safety lead, but you can see in the cardiovascular one, clearly we're going to have a clinical lead in the vascular surgery, because this again is going to be really, really important. And so, and we've got buy-in, we've got clinicians wanting to be part of this, specialist societies, the colleges support it. So I do think we're in a very different place where we can bring all this together in a way that we haven't done before. There are a number of development of the registries with priorities, and we see that as the cardiovascular and the vascular registry as well as cardiac. MSK, clearly. We've then got the mesh procedures. We've got the plastic surgery about the breast cosmetic implant registry, cochlear implants, and some urology. So we know what we want to do, and we're now going to expand them and actually make sure we unify them in a way that's going to provide what we need going forward. So in summary, I think there is now a huge opportunity for the clinical profession to actually help shape what we want to collect, what we want to deliver. We will shape it, we'll transform care and clinical practice, and make all our registries exemplar, both those that are implant initially, but also registries that are non-implant. And that will feed into the Getting It Right First Time program, the National Clinical Improvement Program led by Norman Williams, and clearly then through to procurement through the networks we're developing as we move forward. So I think now is the time. We have got the ear of government. We've got the Cumberland report. I won't say any more about that because that's going to be discussed. But I think we as a profession need to step up to the plate, drive this, and I think it will be very well received by everybody. So can I thank you very much for listening? Thank you.
Tim, that was a fantastic, brilliant summary. I'm sure there'll be some questions. I don't know whether you want to take them now. If you're in clinic, do you want to take some questions?
No, I'm happy. I'm happy to listen and come at the end.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so thank you very much. We will move on to the next talk. So we're going to go back a bit now. This is one of the reasons I got involved in medical devices because of the problems we had in Cambridge with the Nelix device. Seamus has very kindly agreed to present the data and our experience. Seamus, I will point out, was at the time we were putting most of these devices in our BSET fellow, so it wasn't his decision to put them in. But he has been involved in taking quite a few out, I think.
Thank you very much, and thanks, John, for asking me to speak, and thanks for changing the order so I got to follow Tim. Yeah, so disclosure at the start, I don't have any financial disclosures, and I think that's important in this sort of topic. As John sort of alluded to, I'm not particularly an EVAS expert. That's not me trying to distance myself from the technology, it's just a statement of fact. Nor am I a regulatory expert. I just sort of found myself as the most junior consultant being landed with what was turned out to be a very difficult sort of patient safety situation. What I'll say today is largely my opinion, so if anybody's upset by it, they come speak to me about it. It's not the opinion of CUH, it's not John, it's my reflections on what happened. So I think you all probably know what Nelix is, but it was, you know, a revolution in endovascular aneurysm repair. It didn't use active fixation. It used endobags and polymer to stabilize the aneurysm sac. And I think when it first came on the market, the sort of key selling feature was improved durability, particularly with type 2 endoleaks. But as people started to use it more, they found more and more reasons to use it, so it went into much the anatomy was easier, that you could treat, you know, really difficult aneurysms. Procedures were potentially quicker with less radiation and less contrast. And there's even some data published to suggest that there might be improved cardiovascular outcomes in the long term. Interestingly, this is one of the sort of early marketing pictures of an aneurysm treated with Nelix, and you can see that there's no proximal landing zone and there's no distal landing zone. That was their marketing strategy. I work at Cambridge. We are proud to be one of the biggest aortic repair centres in the UK with consistently very good results. As we're a high volume centre, we are attractive to industry, or at least we were attractive to industry. We introduced Nelix in 2013 through a new devices process, which all intents and purposes was an A4 piece of paper that we had to fill in. We initially had limited practitioners doing this, and they built up sort of a head of steam, as it were. And we started with good anatomy, you know, cases that we would consider sort of, you know, really nice for EVAR type thing. There wasn't really any specific audit and governance processes that we needed to stick to, other than putting our data on the MVR, which was routine. So like most new technologies, we started, and I think we liked using it, and then we used it a lot. And I think it's fair to say our initial experience was really positive. There were a few initial technical modifications that were made, but we put that down to new technology, learning a new technique. After we got sort of good initial outcomes, of course, we pushed the envelope, as many people did, and we treated very hostile anatomy. We treated ruptured aneurysms. We started doing so-called CHEVAS, where we were landing high in the visceral segment of the aorta and using parallel grafts. And I think we have to say the unit derived some benefit at the time. We developed one or two key opinion leaders in what was a new technology, and we sort of rode the wave of that a little bit. So I started in 2015, and an email sort of got cascaded down to me saying that EVAS was not an approved procedure from NICE, and so then there needed to be specific audit and governance of that procedure, and that's sort of what started the ball rolling. So we did our first audit, I think, in late 2016, and we got a sense that perhaps there were a few more failures than with our other grafts, but it didn't seem particularly dramatic. And so I think we discussed this as a unit, and we effectively did what I think in retrospect was pretty sensible. We said we'll increase surveillance of these patients, but at the minute there's not enough to get too excited about it. However, it became clear our MDTs were filling up with patients with Nelix devices that were failing. Typically, this was caudal migration and bag separation. We were seeing ruptures. And it became clear to us as a group that this was really a major problem. And at that point, we escalated to our sort of senior management and patient safety structures within the hospital. And I have to say, as has not always been the case, the hospital were actually very helpful in helping us sort this. We established a risk management team, which was typically between 5 and 10 people, led by a plastic surgeon who was great because he really didn't know anything about it, so he was very process focused. And it was pretty straightforward what we had to do. The actual process wasn't straightforward, but effectively, at the outset, we said we have to quantify the problem. So we have to really understand how many patients we've done this in and how many patients have a problem. So although that seems really straightforward, actually finding all the patients was one of the most difficult things, because we treated patients from all over the country. We had patients who moved away. We have a very big network with slightly different surveillance protocols. So actually that was, you know, the bit that it was absolutely crucial that we got right, and it was more difficult, I think, than it should have been in retrospect. We then had this duty of candour to execute, so we wrote to every surviving patient that still had an LX in to tell them that we'd had this sort of safety concern, and we brought them all back to meet us in clinic. There was also, we were sort of mandated from the Trust to communicate our findings to the MHRA and to collaborate with other centres. And really importantly, the Trust told us you have to publish these results so they're in the public domain. And at the time, there was understandable concern about publishing results, I think. So we did all that. It was quite a process. And this is the first Kaplan-Meier curve that we produced. And of course, there were some real sharp intakes of breath when we produced this, and checking the data again, but it was real. So out to 2 years, it looked like the graph performed pretty well. And then, as we saw in each of our MDTs and each of our on-calls, these graphs were falling out, they were failing, and it was really pretty marked. We published this. You know, this was difficult, publishing these results, and we all know there's a bias, publication bias. People publish good results and typically not their bad results. We were nervous about publishing, but thankfully us publishing, I think, gave other people the freedom to publish their results, and it doesn't seem to be it was a Cambridge specific problem. It seemed to be that everybody was having the problem. I might say our results were slightly worse, but I suspect that's to do with how we looked at the data. And we've published our most up-to-date results recently. The typical comeback for this sort of thing is that you were irresponsible with the graft and you put it into anatomy that it was not suited for. And I think you have to put our hands up and say that there is an element of that. However, we were very careful to look back through our cases and whether we adhered to what was the label when we put it in. And the label changes. The labels had 3 or 4 major changes over the years, but it was clear that there was anatomy that we would consider reasonable anatomy, and these grafts were having a catastrophic failure. Another interesting side point is that when we take these out, we find that the polymer doesn't seem to hold up pretty well. We get fragmentation, bags are bursting, major fractures in the polymer. That's a sort of an observational point. There was response from Endologics, and they very much put the responsibility of this at the door of the implanters, saying that the results were suboptimal. I mean, I don't think I would describe them as suboptimal. I think I'd describe them as terrible. And suboptimal when used outside the current instructions for use. So we haven't really seen any data that there's any difference in failure rates between different instructions for use. Our sample size is probably not big enough, but I'm not aware that anybody's really found that. Again, the response, this bottom quote is from the now Chief Executive of Endologics, who very much put it at our door for using it off-label. But he was the same person who was the senior author on this paper, which effectively said that EVAS opened the envelope for endovascular repair, and you can put it into far more people than you can standard EVARs. So I guess there's a conflict there. And again, I point you to this picture, which was their marketing picture at the start. So what have I learned about it? And again, this is my own personal reflections. So IFU, on-label, off-label, what does that mean? Who does that help? Who does that support? It's pretty clear to me that it probably protects the manufacturers. I don't think it protects us as implanters, and it certainly doesn't protect patients particularly. And the label of this graft, as I've mentioned, changed considerably in an iterative way. So it's very difficult to keep up with that when we're talking about long-term outcomes. Labels change. And, you know, I put in a lot of custom-made grafts. We put in a lot of endovascular aneurysm repairs to ruptured aneurysms. And I guess we'd have to ask ourselves, are they on-label, off-label, on IFU? They're not. For custom-made grafts, you typically sign a form saying, you know, you're putting this in without any data. There's a conflict there, which is innovation in EVAR. Typically, the innovation I see is pointing towards treating more people. So smaller access, treating short necks. You know, there's certain techniques that are out there for a 4mm neck, you know, new strategies for angulated necks. And so it's about treating more people. And actually, I think the problem is we treat too many people with hostile anatomy and grafts that don't work in the longer term. My own personal view is that you need some form of healthy landing zone. And there are enough data to say that hostile anatomy really doesn't do well with EVAR. Tied into that is EVAR surveillance. So we all learn in training about different endoleak types, and what became quite clear with NELIX is that you can have a catastrophic proximal seal failure without evidence of an obvious endoleak, as we would categorize it on the scan. And that is not limited to NELIX. That happens in other grafts where there is failure of proximal seal, but you don't see flow in the sac. And unfortunately, I don't think duplex is adequate to assess that. And along those lines, we got feedback from all over the country saying, you know, we only put in 5 or 10 NELIX, but we haven't seen any problems. My assertion is you're probably not looking hard enough. And then this links into what Tim has described much better than I will be able to, but this is about national patient safety structures. You know, at the time, there really wasn't graft-specific data on the NVR. At the minute, our pathway seems to end whenever the patients had their EVAR put in and then gone home. So we're not looking at long-term outcomes in terms of re-interventions, and actually being much more ambitious than that. And looking at anatomy on a nationwide scale, looking at post-operative surveillance. Are we scanning at routine intervals, and are we picking up on the signals that a graft's failing? Because I suspect some places probably aren't. And I think for real improvement, the MVR does need to improve. We need to start considering this as an operation that shows benefit at 5 and 10 years, not at 30 days. And I think if we're really ambitious, we can embed pragmatic clinical trials into those data. So just to finish, what have Eve asked now? When I was writing this talk, I assumed it would all be in the past tense. It's not. These are some screenshots from VEITH last week, and they are reporting good results in the second IDE study. Again, I would mention good results at 2 years. We had good results at 2 years. So watch this space. It doesn't, at the minute, it's not a sort of unpleasant historical footnote that these graphs are still going into people, albeit not in the UK. Okay, I think I stayed the time.
We're now going to go to industry and ask Declan Dunphy to come. Declan is the chair of Association of British Health Technological Industries, the cardiovascular group, basically the ABHI. Thank you. Thank you very much, Declan. You're going to talk to us about the importance of device surveillance to industry.
Thank you. It's a bit of a mouthful, ABHI. Obviously, following Seamus's talk, industry is very, very much supportive of device surveillance. So if we look at it from an industry perspective, I'm going to talk to you about why we're supportive. Actually, surveillance is an enabler for innovation. Obviously, company ethics are at the core, and obviously I'll talk to you about a conclusion of that. Bit of a busy slide, but if we look at industry support for regulation, priority number one for us, and then for number one you, is patient safety. And that's why surveillance is the key. All clinical interventions, we obviously know, have an inherent amount of risk, but if actually we have good device surveillance, proactively but also reactively, that supports and manages our risk management area. And risk management is very, very important from an industry perspective, but actually it's even more important from the clinical perspective. We see lots more regulation coming, requiring us to do more proactive and reactive studies, so post-market surveillance. We welcome that. But actually we have kind of potentially a two-tier system coming up where we have MDR and we have the expected UK CEA mark coming as well. So how does industry tackle that? We obviously want to support it, but it can't be overly onerous as well. Increased information available to support the clinical decision is key, and we see that as being a real benefit of surveillance. So allowing you guys to know which actually treatments or which product or device to be able to treat that appropriate patient. And it kind of ties in with, well, is this actually suitable for this patient or not, or is it on IFU or off IFU? We actually see surveillance actually helping enable innovation. We all know that medical devices are iterative. We know that one device leads to the next device. So how do we know if the prior device actually works or not? So it's very important with surveillance that we have that data so we can take it, to the next stage. Does that work or doesn't it work? I think we look at product development. That includes collaboration with our clinical colleagues. And obviously, collaboration is key, but we actually need to know, does that device work? And that ties back to surveillance. Increased information enables us to innovate quicker. It allows us to develop technology, but actually drives the life cycle management. So surveillance, again, tells us what's working and what's not working. But I want to talk to you about company ethics, and I think that has to be at the core of what we do. I can't pronounce the word now in my mouth. Linked to risk management, it's really, risk management has to be key and the core of your ethical company. The company I work for is actually risk management averse. They want to be really safe. They don't want to be on the other side of that. An auditable quality management system is the foundation. All these companies, all our industry bodies, members of ABHI have auditable quality management systems, and they are being continuously audited via FDA, if it's to Japan, China. Actually, even some European countries come now to visit your facilities, look at all the data, etc. So in conclusion, from an industry's perspective, regulation is constantly being updated, developed, and become more robust. And it's encompassing a wider group of stakeholders. And we totally recommend and we totally support that. Vigilance and post-market studies drive risk management, as I said, but actually they actually drive product development. And actually we want to give you a safer product, learning from what we've had in the product before, but actually developing something that actually brings patient safety. All of these processes are enshrined in companies' practices via an auditable quality management system, as I said. Any change, any IFU development has to be notified, it has to be changed, it has to go through regulatory, etc., etc. And if we talk about, from an industry perspective, supporting the NVR, we feel that a registry of registries is recommended, but it has to have clear criteria of how that registry becomes formal, accredited, and validated. We see one of the biggest things that from a cardiovascular group is the support of the NVR. And that is a big step forward. We'd love to see it actually progressing, not just from aortic devices to iliac devices, stents, non-implantables, embolization coils, all these different areas. But we need your support to do that. And obviously the ascertainment rates that we're getting currently is absolutely great. John obviously led that, and we see Sam and David doing, keep pushing that from that side. Obviously, from an industry perspective, we look forward to the Cumberledge review, but we actually ask the question is, who's actually going to fund this registry and where that money is going to come from? Is it an industry supported, like the NGR, where we have subscriptions, and I think that's key, but actually there needs to be a wider thought about how do we manage these registries and fund it. So I would like to thank you for listening, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Declan. If you come and sit down over here, we'll have questions at the end. We'll move on. The next speaker, I'm very pleased, is Sonia Mcleod. Sonia was the lead researcher on the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, which is better known as either the Cumberledge Review or First Do No Harm report. So Sonia is a lawyer, and she's talking to lots of surgeons, but I'm sure she'll give us a fantastic talk. So Sonia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. I will just do a very brief overview of First Do No Harm. It was quite an unusual review in that it was primarily focused on women, female patients, with 3 interventions to look at, 2 pharmaceutical and 1 device. And they spanned an incredibly long time period. So the hormone pregnancy test started being used in the 50s through to the 1970s. Valparate, again, 70s through to current today. And pelvic mesh, we looked at mesh for stress urinary incontinence, which started sort of mid-90s, and mesh for pelvic organ prolapse, which really started from 2000. So we spanned a really wide time period, and this sort of meant it required a very system-wide analysis. So we did something which is the first thing we focused on was our patients and our families first. Their perspective sat at the absolute heart of our review because we felt that it was really important to hear their voices, particularly as there had been a lack of listening to their perspective for some years, if not decades in some cases. So we went, we visited, and we actually sat down and spoke to the patients. And for some of them, that was the first time people had really listened to what had happened to them. And we heard from thousands of affected patients. Now, as we went through, we made 9 recommendations. The first was an apology. The second was the establishment of a patient safety commissioner, a redress agency to support anyone who would be harmed by medicines and devices in the future, and financial assistance schemes for those who'd been harmed by the 3 interventions that we had looked at. We also thought that as well as financial assistance, there was a need for specialist centres to provide a comprehensive treatment, care and advice for the patients that we'd seen who had been harmed. Our 6th recommendation, which I will talk about in more detail, was that the MHRA needed revision, both really in terms of ADR reporting, medical device regulation, and the way it engaged with patients and with their outcomes. Our 7th recommendation, which we've heard a little bit about already and which I will speak a little bit more, was a patient identifying database of implantable devices containing details of all medical devices at the point of implantation. Recommendation 8, which I'm just going to touch on very briefly, but I'm not going to speak a lot about, was that the GMC expand their register to include financial and non-financial interests, and the establishment of payment reporting requirements on manufacturers. There is a real need for patients to know if someone is paying their surgeon. Also, there is a need, and that has to come on both sides of the coin. So it has to be both doctor reporting, practitioner reporting, and also industry reporting, as you see in a lot of other countries like the US and their Sunshine Payment Act. And our final recommendation was a task force to oversee implementation. Now, today I'm only actually going to talk really in depth about 2 of these, which is recommendations 6 and 7. So if I go to recommendation 6, the MHRA needs significant revision, particularly in relation to adverse event reporting and medical device regulation. Now, adverse event reporting, the yellow card's been in existence for a very long time, but it's not very well known. And in one way, one of the very few positives of COVID is that it has actually raised the profile of the MHRA in public perception and in terms of yellow card reporting. The vaccine scheme, the vaccine yellow card report, has made more people aware of the MHRA, of its function and what it does, and of the fact that anyone can report an adverse event. However, the profile is still considerably lower than if you look across the Atlantic and the FDA, and it still needs to be sort of raised both with the public, but also with professionals for adverse event reporting. And part of that, we felt, would be to make the databases more accessible, so that if you report adverse events, you can search them, they're there. The FDA has McLeod, the manufacturers and users devices system, which anyone can go, they can search by device, they can search by setting. They've also got the equivalent, the FDA adverse event reporting system for pharmaceuticals. Again, the same thing applies. There is information available there for people, for anyone to go and find it. And we think it's really, we felt it was really important that there should be this public accessibility. Now, if I move on to medical device regulation, obviously the consultation on the CA marking and the regulations closed last week. So it's a little bit early to kind of be making pronouncements about that. But we were pleased to see in there were provisions about greater openness for patients. So the sort of UDI database that people can find information. And that the provisions there, we were very concerned, should be at least as stringent as the EU under the MDR. So we were sort of pleased to see the focus on clinical investigations and on post-market surveillance, and the assessment about looking at routes to market to sort of prevent forum shopping and things like that, which we know have been a problem in the past. As I said, the consultation closed next week, so until we've got a sort of an analysis of that, which I can't imagine will be hugely quick given the scope of the consultation, I think anyone that filled it in would be, well, you've got my sympathy. It was not a small consultation. But yeah, we'll have to really wait and see what comes through from that. So if I move on to our recommendation 7, which I think is the one that will be of most interest to people here. A central patient identifying database containing key details of all implanted devices. And that can then be used as a springboard to create registers which can be used to research and to audit the outcomes. Now, one of the things that was really quite shocking when we went through the review was there was an estimate of how many people had had these interventions. Now, when you think about something like hormone pregnancy tests that were on the market from primary care 1950s to 1970s, you sort of go, well, yeah, okay, we can see GP record keeping might not have been that great in the 1950s. When we're talking implanted devices from the 1990s and the 2000s, the fact that when we said, well, how many women had mesh implanted, and the system couldn't tell us. Absolutely awful when you think about it. And it was one of the things that struck us. And we said, well, come on, you've got to be able to do this. And it was really interesting to hear Seamus see that part of the process was difficult. When we spoke to people, they're like, well, we could go back, we could look at our records, we'd have to go back to the operation records, and in some cases they were paper records. That shouldn't be the case now. And that's one of the things we were really keen should be addressed. And we took quite a lot of advice on this, and our conclusion was that legitimacy under GDPR required a separation of a database and a registry. And a database we defined as something that could be legally mandated in the public interest and would hold a very limited patient-related data set. So that would be down at the patient's NHS number, date of birth, gender, UDI, the name, GMC number of the surgeon, and the hospital where it happened, and the date of the procedure. It was very, very limited, and that was a very deliberate policy, whereas we defined a registry as something that would act as a repository for far more complex patient information, enabling research and investigation into patient outcomes, and that would require patient consent. Now, I know it seems semantics, but we talk about these things and it's like the terminology, the National Vascular Registry is far more like our database and less of a registry. We really envisage the database as having a track and trace function, so it would be useful for things like the NELEX system. You could literally identify patients, monitor patients, and track them through. This is in contrast to the use of a registry, which is that far more complex, rich data set which we were very aware should include patient perspectives. And I was really pleased to see on Tim's slide earlier the importance of proms and prems. From our review, one of the things that was really lost was the patient voice. We had a lot of instances where we talked to women who'd had mesh implanted who said, well, my surgeon says my operation's a success because I was continent, and that was the outcome that was recorded. And yes, if you look at it in those terms, the operation was a success. But if you look at it in every other term, you have a woman in pain, whose sex life was completely compromised, whose day-to-day mobility was impacted, and you think, well, how can that be a successful outcome? And the answer is it was because you weren't actually hearing the patient voice. So we absolutely clear in our report that there has to be a much stronger representation for patients, and that comes through proms and prems. But also, there has to be much longer term follow-up. A short-term follow-up doesn't work for a lot of devices. You see the Nelix device, 2 years success, 4 years not. With pelvic mesh, we found there were women who were seemingly perfectly okay for years, in some cases, decades. And then, absolutely not. So this long-term follow-up has to be built in, but that will be a part of the registries as we envisage them, doing that in-depth, patient-focused, longer-term work to ensure that once a device is in, it is doing what we think it's doing, and it's working well for the patient. So our recommendations were really intended to make the system safer and also more transparent in the future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sonia. Would you like to come and take a seat here and we'll have some questions at the end?
So our final speaker for this section is Aaron Fawani, who is the chair of our Audit and Quality Committee and is also the clinical lead for the National Vascular Registry. He's going to be talking about aortic device capture and re-intervention, early results from the NVR.
Madam Chairman, John, my Vice President colleague, many thanks for this opportunity. The advantage of being last in the session is most of the preamble and the preliminary work supporting what I have to tell you has been done by my predecessors in this session who've been wonderful. And also hence Viragan yesterday. I get paid a PA from the College of Surgeons to do this role, and the only other declaration is I went out for a meal last night with industry, which I shall put into my annual appraisal. The NVR is very modestly funded. We collect data on procedures and outcomes, and at 30 days, we're commissioned through a national program of audits, the NCAPOP program. And as I said, we're limited in what we can do. A lot of the credit for the work that I'm going to talk to you about goes to the people who run the National Vascular Registry. David Cromwell, Sam, who sat there, our superb NVR manager, and particularly my predecessor, John, who did a lot of work with the aortic devices. Not only did we start capturing aortic device-related data, but something that went perhaps a little bit under the radar was the revision aortic information that we started capturing. The advantage I have is I can now give you some information, clinical information, which is data-driven rather than opinion, which I'll leave for the end. You've heard a lot about the Nelix device, but also I want to draw your attention to the Navion thoracic stent graft, which was subject to a worldwide recall earlier this year. People ask us sometimes, why do we need to capture device-related information on open aneurysms? Well, actually, people who undergo open aneurysms, patients who undergo open aneurysm surgery, are not free from developing further aortic disease later on in their lives. There is proximal and distal arterial disease, dilatation, narrowing, etc. endo leaks are also seen after open aneurysm surgery, and of course the dreaded complication of graft infection. Now, the NVR did help with the recall around the Nelix device. We were asked by NICE to change our data sets, that EVAS was recorded as a separate entity to EVAR. The NVR provided summary data on the number of procedures and the hospitals wherein these procedures were undertaken to the MHRA in 2018 to assist with the field safety notice and the recall. These data were also provided to the 3 designated re-intervention units which were explanting these devices. With the Valiant Navion thoracic stent graft, we were at the advantage, and this is an example of how the NVR can help. Because we'd started collecting device-related information, we had 25 individual patients and devices recorded on the NVR. So we were able to go back to those 8 units and write to them saying that they had these patients with the thoracic stent graft that we were able to identify from a national registry. Fact, not opinion. You've heard a lot about the Cumberland report, and particularly one of the highlights was to collect and publish information on implantable medical devices to monitor safety. Subsequent to that was the HQIP short report on collecting device-related data. And I was very pleased to bring you the work that John and my colleagues from the NVR team started off, which was the first short report on aortic device data capture that our colleagues from industry who had supported the pilot study were also interested in and funded. In addition, what we have is in the AAA aortic devices and revisions data entry guide. I have paper copies of this with Sam at the NVR stand. We also have a demo device data entry computer setup with a barcode scanner. And we've been speaking to our colleagues from industry to help streamline this device data entry onto the registry. As you can see from this graph, from the time we started collecting device data, July last year to now, the number of devices that have gone on month by month has increased, and that is a credit to you. We were also able to capture some devices retrospectively that were put in the early part of 2020. When you look at more recent data, we're very pleased to say that about 60% of aortic devices are now being captured on the NVR. And for a non-mandatory field, we think that's very good. We don't want to sit there. We would want greater than 95% case ascertainment, understandably. When we look at trusts putting in devices, you can see in the clear circles data from 2020, and in the green highlights tell you device data entry from each trust in the year 2021. So obviously, if you're going from clear to green across the graph, you're doing better in terms of device data entry. In terms of what device we capture in terms of aneurysm repair, clearly the EVAR, the complex EVAR, and the revision EVAR devices are being captured. We did have some problems with some of the open aortic grafts, but we've addressed those now, and so we're starting to see a greater number of open aneurysm repairs and those grafts being captured. Just another way to show you the same data, but also to tell you that we are capturing both elective and emergency EVAR, so EVAR done for ruptures. You will note from the NVR report that in 2020, the number of patients being treated with ruptured aneurysms and EVAR has increased to just over 40%. And I'm pleased that these data are being captured on NVR along with the device-related data. Similarly, for TVAR, we are capturing both elective and emergency procedures. I told you about the revision aortic data set, and the largest number of procedures are being captured for sac expansion. And that's really the treatment of type 2 endoleaks, type 1A endoleaks, etc. There's a proportion of patients who've had graft migration, false aneurysms, new arterial disease, which includes both aneurysmal disease and occlusive disease above and below proximal and distal landing zones or involving these landing zones. And there's a smattering of others. When you look at what types of procedures have been done, relining of stent grafts seems to be the most common, along with proximal cuffs, fenestrated cuffs, giant palmhouses, embolizations, which include onyx embolizations or embolizations of endoleaks, extensions, as I talked about, and a smattering of endoanchors, etc. We've also got explant information, and some of you have very kindly helped us with supporting our Vascular colleagues' explant database, which is being led from Granada. Now then, what are our next steps? We've got to eventually make device data fields mandatory, and as I said, we're aiming for a greater than 95% case ascertainment rate. We work very closely with our partners, the ABHI, the MHRA, Northgate, who is our IT provider, and of course, HQIP, who own our data and fund us. We would aim to go down the path of a subscription funding model with contribution from industry, which is exactly what the NJR does, and my next slide will tell you in detail. What we'd like to do is provide real-time device-related information to industry and reports annually, and expand the data sets eventually to include both the carotid procedures, the patches, etc., the carotid stenting devices, and a host of lower limb stents that are used according to anatomical location. To be able to do this, we require clarity from government, from the Department of Health. We require the resources and the funding for registries such as ours to be able to capture and produce these data sets and reports. And fundamentally, to support all of us in the audience, we require the personnel in terms of data managers to help capture this information. There are so many players in this field, and what we'd like to see is this single digital platform wherein once a device is open, a device X with a lot number and batch number implanted by an implanter Y and their GMC number, okay, we're in a patient with their NHS number onto seamlessly a devices registry and a national registry. We're working with the MDSP and the MDIS, which is led by Professor Briggs and Gerth, and John's our representative there, but we've also had approach from the College of Surgeons around the Joint Devices Science and Registry Group. The NJR runs a very successful funding model, and I put in an application to NHS England very similarly. It works on top-up tariff up to the region of 4% for the trusts, which then allows £21 per device going into the National Joint Registry. Ladies and gentlemen, in the annual report, we were able to show you that there was a significant reduction in the number of elective aneurysms done during COVID, both in the first and the second wave of the pandemic. Gradually, over the last 3 years, we've seen also a reduction in EVAR. And this reduction seems to be most pronounced in the youngest and the oldest patients we treat. Because of COVID, we've had a backlog of about 1,200 patients with aneurysmal disease. And this year, for all of us, hasn't been very good, has it? Whilst we're here at the conference, colleagues are back home at the ranch, struggling to get elective activity done because nurses are still being pulled out of high dependency units to support intensive care. We made recommendations that patients with aneurysms should be prioritized, very similar to cancer patients, and require their treatment. Opinion. We'd like to move away from the rancor of the nice debates, the counterclaims and the claims, the various European journal papers. Patients don't need this debate. They're not interested in whether open repair or EVAR is the more superior one or which guidelines we should use. What they want is honesty, unbiased opinions, the truth as part of informed consent. And what we would like to see is the national registries such as ours take the responsibility for accountability. Much after I will go, I would like to see the NVR as the definitive, reliable, reproducible, independent source of unbiased data, long-term outcomes for the devices that we implant in our patients and for our profession. Thank you very much for listening.
Arun, come and sit down, and we've got 10 minutes for questions. I'm sure, it's been a fantastic session, so hopefully that's stimulated the audience to ask some questions. I think I can see Bruce with his hand up, so Bruce, do you want to kick us off?
Bruce Campbell from Exeter, and I've got a question for Tim, but just to offload some emotional baggage first. I've been involved in beating the drum for this kind of data collection with the setup and the governance of the NVR, with my work for NICE, with the IDEO collaboration, and latterly as a non-executive director of the MHRA. I'm now involved in advising NHSX, who have been asked to address the business of ensuring that all trusts upload information on every implant that is made. And one of the first points that we made to them was that, hang on, wait a minute, this has to be done in tune with all these national registers. And what we cannot have is complex, clunky data input, duplicative data input by clinicians, both for the MDIS, which is by law, to the various registers, and also, Sonia, for adverse events. They should be able to put them in once. And my question for Tim is, what are you doing at strategic level to try to ensure that there isn't clunky, duplicative data collection?
So thank you, indeed. Totally agree with you. We're on the case. Okay, so I think what's happened in the last 2 weeks with the announcement of NHSX, NHSD, and NHSEI coming together in terms of the data analytics is absolutely crucial. Because what we need is two things. We need one version of the analytics, so we can all stand behind that as clinicians when we talk to our patients about which registry you are. And we need one version of the clinical input that we ask the questions that we want the analytics to build for us in terms of registries. And I think there is now an understanding that that's the way we're going to go. And I was on a board meeting yesterday with NHSX, NHSD, and ourselves, but I'm also working with Ming Tang, who's head of analytics in NHSEI. And as that comes together, we want one version, and that's what we will, I hopefully achieve. We want MDIS, but what's the analytic platform we want building based on the clinical question? So we've got now the clinical voice coming together. We're going to get the analytics coming together so we can drive these registries.
Thank you. Mike Jenkins, the President.
Thanks, John. Very good session. You will recall that when anecdotally we knew there were NELIX problems, there was a registry, but it was an industry-sponsored registry, and people were going around the world saying everything is okay. I suppose my question to Arun is, the most valuable slide this morning was one Tim showed with the mean outcome performance of standard devices overlaid with the new device, showing a variation in real time. My understanding of the current NVR uploading is some people do it in real time, but then other people do a big tranche a year in advance. If we're going to make this work, I presume we need everyone to do it in real time.
In real time, yes. And that we can provide real-time reports about individual manufacturers, individual stent grafts, usage, head-to-head comparisons, exactly as Tim's shown with the NJR.
And the other thing, just to come back, one thing that Sonia showed was sometimes our outcome measures are not the same as patient outcome measures. So we need to be aware that with a new device, we may be picking up some adverse outcome that we hadn't predicted and need some vehicle to recognize that as well.
Sonia, do you want to comment on that? Or?
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the things that was really striking for us is that sort of difference between the outcomes that the surgeons who were implanting mesh were measuring and that the patients were reporting. And I think it is very difficult because validated problems take a long time. We know that. But there is actually a value in not dismissing individual patient reports as anecdotal and just saying, okay, what I've got here, maybe someone else has got that, and asking the question, because it's only when you start to open your mind to the possibility that this may be causing a problem and therefore ask the question of colleagues, of friends, of networks to say, has anyone else flagged this? Then we start to get the ability to detect these things.
Colin Bicknell.
Thanks very much. This is excellent, of course, and I don't want it to be seen as a criticism, but if we collect patient information and device information, and then we also collect when they have a redo or re-intervention, aren't we then collecting information a little bit too late when there are early markers of endoleak and sac expansion that we could be collecting? Isn't it also missing groups of patients who are swept under the carpet or not operated on because they're a little bit old later on and we don't do anything with them, and perhaps they could tell us a sign? And isn't there an opportunity that we're missing in not making sure everyone has the responsibility and not losing all these people to follow up? We know it's awful in most places or ignored in the other places.
Do you want to take that, Arun, or shall I start? You take it and I can come back as well.
So there's 3 questions you've actually asked, Colin. Okay. The first question was about outcomes and revision. And hopefully, with the maturity of device data capture, we will be able to pick up, as happened with the Nelix device, early re-interventions that are associated with a particular device. The second question was about turndowns. We've long argued that a true reflection of an aortic practice is the number of patients who are turned down. Unfortunately, as Rob will know very well, there is no code to capture a turn down. Okay. And the third question I forgot.
So, Colin, about when we started on this road, I spent time with the National Joint Registry team and with Tim, and it was clear to me that their measure of long-term outcome revision was very effective in the orthopaedic patient population, not only to identify failing devices, but also to identify failing units with high revision rates. And I think I fully take your point. We have got the ability with the NBR to link the data set. So, I mean, one of the things we won't capture here is as you say, a failed aneurysm repair that ruptures and is palliated when they come to the emergency department. That won't be captured, but we can link with HES data and with ONS data. So there is the ability to pick up those endpoints as well. But I think from my perspective, and I think Seamus would probably agree with me, I think we would have probably, if we'd had this system in place, we would have probably identified these devices failing earlier. And we implanted, I think it was 163 Nelix. I think we would have probably implanted less than 100, because if we'd had the signals from around the country and the other places like St George's and Liverpool from a registry like we've now got, then I think we would have stopped implanting the device, and that would have saved those patients, operations that clearly weren't going to work in hindsight.
Yeah, there was an early signal with Nelix when we've retrospectively looked at it, but I entirely agree with you that I don't think re-intervention is the right metric long-term for aneurysms, because you're right. There are patients everywhere who their aneurysm just gets bigger and bigger, and then they're no longer in surveillance.
I mean, Colin, realistically, what you're asking for is the entire medical record to be part of the registry, which, the data from the blood flow lab, the data from the radiology. It would be lovely, wouldn't it? If we could actually have properly coded records and events taking place, so we can actually see what surveillance is taking place. But it's small steps. I think until we've actually got a properly electronic medical record that actually is properly coded and is properly used, we're never going to get that sort of granularity, are we?
I mean, it's early days. I think we've made massive progress since we started this. So we're not with a joint registry, but we're probably now seen as the second registry in terms of value for collecting devices. So we've made big progress. I'm aware it's 10:30. We've got lots of questions, so I want to try and get through all of them, and then we'll go for coffee. Sorry.
Great presentations this morning. A quick question to Sonia about patient consent. If I understood you correctly, you were saying that for the sort of the core record, the database record, consent would not be required, whereas for registries, consent would be required. That seems slightly back to front from my point of view, because the track and trace is after there's a problem. The registry tells you that there is a problem. There's a big sort of cost and overhead of collecting patient consent for registries. And I know of some registries who've deliberately chosen not to collect personal data to avoid having to do that. And then you can't link the data and do all the stuff we've been talking about this morning.
Absolutely. We took quite extensive legal advice on that point because we were quite aware of the GDPR implications, and that our position reflects the advice we were given, which is that you can mandate the collection of the core database on public health grounds. The more detailed, richer data that has to go into the registries, obviously including PROMs and PREMs. Now, clearly those have to be collected with patient consent because there's no other way of doing that. But that richer data should be done with patient consent was the advice we received.
Act on the scene.
Great session. My sort of question will be aimed at Seamus. I thought that was a good, honest reflection. But what I would say is that registries and data collection are definitely the way to go to enable investigation if something goes wrong. As a profession, do you think we were gullible and again we're gullible or naive when we adopt new technology and there is over-enthusiasm before we have enough data? We were sold on the concept of EVAR, but not EVAS. EVAS had a unique selling point, and because it targeted an area that EVAR didn't have a straightforward solution for, do you think that people very quickly adopted it? And then, obviously...
Yeah, I mean, yes. But we don't have a national structure for introduction of new technology. I guess the CLEVAR registry for the new Gore graph might be an example of how we run it nationally. But it's 5-10 years. That's, you know, and there's a conflict there, isn't there? Because no device companies want to sort of be marketing their device for 10 years. But that's what we're looking at. And you're right. You know, graph companies do come to people who they think may be key opinion leaders who will be able to promote their product. And that's why when we talk about having disclosures, it's really important. It's really important. When people come up, they often use it as a badge of honor to say, I get paid by these 5 different companies. But actually, that's really important because you have to take what they say in that context.
I agree. So the question is, do we put in a structure that says, yes, you put the data set on devices and registries, but should there be more structure in terms of limit on how much a device is used until some data becomes available?
Yes, I think probably yes, but it's going to take 10 years. And that's a tricky...
There's a balance here, isn't there, Akhtar? And I think there's a balance between innovation and, you know, some innovations are very beneficial for our patients, and you know, clearly there's a balance with safety as well. So, you know, we've now swung probably in Cambridge the other way, so we're now much more focused on patient safety and less focused on innovation. But we've got to get a balance. You can't expect industry to produce 10-year data on a new device before it's allowed to be used widely.
But what you can expect is, and what you can see is that there should be a very clear post-market surveillance plan in place for that device to say, this is what we're collecting, this is what we're doing with it. And I think that that's one of the things that was quite, the MHRA consultation on device regulation you see coming in more strongly is this focus on having a very clear post-market surveillance plan in place that people then follow through. So I think that will be part of the solution.
Declan, do you want to comment on the industry perspective?
Yeah, the regulations are quite robust now that we have to be able to supply data, so I totally agree. Bringing a product to 10 years to market, well, if it's safe and effective, then that's probably what we need to do. But I think it's actually more important that you guys follow up with the patient, follow up and see what's happening to that patient, because 30 days is probably a bit short. So I would encourage, that actually follow-up is the key and that it's not lost to follow-up.
We've got 2 more questions. I'm going to go over here and then we'll come back to Professor Sayers for the last one.
Thomas Joseph from Preston. Couple of questions. I was fascinated to see the broken polymers. Currently, there is still in the market use of polymer ring for sealing. So what should we do about
it? No idea. Don't ask me.
Continue using it?
Don't use it.
So I mean, in terms of the polymer, those pictures you saw of the broken polymer, we actually sent those off to the G Provas in France, and they analysed the polymer. So if you have got devices you explant, there are places that will analyse things closely. But yeah, I mean, the polymer clearly wasn't working as it should have done when we explanted it. I think that's fair to say, Seamus.
Yeah. So what I would say is make sure all your devices are recorded on, on the NVR. If there is a revision that's associated with a device that has had polymer technology, record the revision. And if you're seeing a pattern of such patients coming forward, report it to the company and to the MHRA, because that's the legal process that one has to follow.
My second question was about follow-up. So new guidance is coming up on follow-up criteria, for example, moving from CT angiograms to ultrasound surveillance. And I also heard here today the proximal leak, for example, type 1A may not be picked up by ultrasound scans. So we are not only the device is moving, we are also moving along with all the criteria on following up. So should we stay put with the previous plan of following up with the CT angiograms rigorously, or should we move with the ESVS guidance?
James, do you want to comment on that?
I think EVAR surveillance is really difficult. We've got a massive program with well over 1,000 patients in it, and we have patients whose sacs are getting bigger, and we don't know. And the CT findings don't always correlate with the duplex findings. I'm not sure I can inform what the national process is going to be, but it's clear to me that post-op sac progression is really difficult to manage, and we don't have one good diagnostic test or indeed one good therapeutic option.
Okay, so final question, Professor Sayers.
Rob Sayers, Leicester. We seem to be, when new devices come along, put under a lot of pressure to drop our existing devices, that have often stood the test of time because there's something new, and that's a problem. We want to innovate, but equally we seem to throw out everything that we've achieved. Has the panel got any views on whether that's good practice or not?
So that's Maroon, Seamus. Do you know?
I think it's back to having a national process for introduction of new technology in perhaps designated centres.
So I think the NJR is the guidance really we need to look at. So when new devices are introduced, they are benchmarked against current market leaders and current devices before anything old is put into the bin, and then the new device becomes de rigueur.
Tim, are you still online? Do you want to just give us the final comment on introducing new devices? I mean, obviously in orthopaedics you've introduced lots. He's just had to leave us to okay, he's gone. Okay. Right. We will, I think it's been a fantastic session. Thank you to all the speakers. Really interesting stuff. Thanks to the audience for participating. Coffee.